when Kenya was sort of became independent, not everyone, particularly in the peripheries, accepted the Kenyan state as it is. And the Somalis in particular have led an insurgency against the Kenyan state for about 4 years, between 63 and 67. They wanted to be part of Somali Republic. They didn't want to be part of Kenya. And there was an opinion carried out by the British colonial government at the time, which they overwhelmingly voted for secession and joining Somalia. And then that led to sort of the violence and then the neglect from the state. So there was very little investment in terms of development, in terms of youth employment, education. As I said, there's a lot of communal violence as well between tribes and the clans. And then when the war came to an end, that of course didn't mean the end of everything. So the state forces that carried out some of the atrocities in northern Kenya were given amnesty by the state. So there's the Indemnity Act of the 1970, which basically gave them amnesty for the crimes they committed. Essentially, this means Kenya, by 60s, did not deal with its past. So it was complete failure of that. And the violence that we're seeing now is actually very much sort of steeped in the history of Kenya. And this is where the connection is and where this report comes in, because Al-Shabaab are actually using that history and sort of the exclusion, political, economic, social exclusion, as a propaganda, of course, for their sort of that victimization narrative. And they're using that successfully in a way that the Kenyan state hasn't, managed to do that. Of course, Kenya is interpreting Al-Shabaab as a threat from Somalia, and you can clearly see they're making that link between the current and sort of the past. And the same way, communities are also doing that. When Kenya talks about, for example, they're imposing a curfew now in northern Kenya, some of the communities, they remember that. They remember the curfews of the 60s, they remember the mass arrests. So when Kenya carries out security operation in Isli neighborhood of Nairobi now, communities, of course, make connections with what was happening in the 60s and the way Kenyans were indiscriminate arrest. So it fits into that same pattern. So this is really a continuation of sort of the old history. It offers very good insights into the whole, as the title says, the links between, the ties between Al-Shabaab and sort of the history of violence in Kenya. And it makes that clear. And this is what has been missing in the current narrative. So Al-Shabaab violence is not an isolated violence. It's very much linked with the history of violence in Kenya, particularly in its margins. And he also talks about the state violence, particularly by the security forces. And the one way to tackle, the security forces, of course, as it says in the report, is the issue of accountability of the security forces. And it links back to the point I was making when it comes to the history of Kenya, of where the state security forces that carried out some of the atrocities in the north were given, amnesty for some of their crimes. Some of the communities actually they don't know what happened to them. They know that there was an insurgency, they were caught up between the shifta, which was the insurgents, and the Kenyan state, but they don't know what happened to their loved ones, they don't know what happened to themselves. There was sexual violence against women, disappearances of people, displacement, and all that. So by actually introducing accountability, particularly the state forces, it stops, because the violations are still continuing, particularly allegations of violations against the security forces in the north and in Isli, of course, which is a neighborhood of the Somali neighborhood in Nairobi. The report is right in saying, we don't need to externalize this problem. This is an internal Kenyan problem. Of course, there's a spillover of Al-Shabaab from Somalia, which is part of the story, but the most of it is to do with Kenyan citizens. There are several things the Kenyan government can do. I think the first is Kenya should see its Somali citizens as an asset. As I said, of course, they fought against the Kenyan government in the 60s. There was that insurgency. But increasingly, particularly after the collapse of the Somali government in the 90s, the Kenyan Somali, what we're calling the Kenyan citizens, of course, are called Kenyan Somalis, they've largely reconciled with the Kenyan state. And if you go back to all the three counties of Kenyan Somalis in Kenya, and you ask them whether they're Kenyans or not, they will tell you 100% Kenyans. So this is a situation where the Somalis have accepted Kenyanness, but there are questions whether Kenya has actually accepted them as a citizen. So I think Kenya should accept them as citizens, accept them as an asset, as people who can contribute to the development of Kenya, and invest in them. So that's the main thing. I think what linked to that is, of course, Kenya should avoid sort of this blanket approach when it comes to security. These mass arrests, discrimination, even expulsion to some of the Kenyan Somali citizens to Somalia. The second thing, of course, is linked to the Kenyan military deployment in Somalia. What's happening there is, I think there's this false sort of dichotomy between the Kenyans should withdraw their forces and Kenyans should stay in. I think the debate is actually, it's not that. The debate is, what are the Kenyan forces doing in Somalia? Why, they've captured Kismayo, which is this big city in southern Somalia, in October 2012, and since then they have not carried out any offensive against Al-Shabaab, and this is giving space and time for Al-Shabaab to actually carry out attacks in Kenya. One thing they can do is they can do several things. One, they can do an audit of the Kenyan security forces in Somalia, what the operation, and actually find out what was the aim, are they meeting the aims, and what's the exit strategy. I mean, this is something that easily the parliamentary committee can carry out. And they should also address one of the claims of Al-Shabaab that Kenyan security forces, the Kenyan Defense Forces, KDF, are carrying out atrocities against Somali civilians. This is Al-Shabaab's propaganda. And the only way you can counter that is to actually independently carry out investigation into the Kenyan deployment and sort of as a way of countering that propaganda. The third thing I think Kenya can do is, as I said, Kenya has a history of dealing with insurgency in the north. There are questions, of course, of how they dealt with that, but they have a history. So what Kenya can do is it can start looking back at history, learning from its mistakes, and of course dealing with that past. Because Kenyan Somalis, that was a war against its citizens, and of course it's ended and it needs to reconcile with its citizens. And the starting point for that is the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, which has documented this war and the insurgency and what has happened. And of course it's commendable that the Kenyan president has already issued a public apology for some of the past violations against against Kenyan citizens. And he's already even agreed to set up a repression fund, a compensation for the victims of this war. What Kenya needs to do now is it doesn't need to be distracted from that cause, particularly by Al-Shabaab attacks. It needs to maintain that momentum. It needs to deal with its past. And I think that's what Kenya needs to change.